bank manager didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. That was the part that scared me. She closed the folder, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at me the way doctors do right before they say something that changes your life. "Sir," she said quietly, glancing once at the passbook on the table, "you need to sit down." I was already sitting, but my legs felt hollow anyway, like the floor had dropped an inch without warning. Around us, the bank continued as normal, printers humming, a pen clinking onto a counter, someone laughing softly near the lobby coffee station. No alarms, no shouting. Just that sentence hanging between us, heavy and final. All of this because of my father's old passbook. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Ethan Harlow. I'm 46 years old, and until the week my father died, the most stressful thing in my life was a cracked heat exchanger I couldn't quite source a replacement for. I work in HVAC maintenance, mostly residential, some light commercial. It's honest work, loud work. The kind of job where your knees ache at night and your hands smell like metal and dust no matter how hard you scrub. I live outside Cleveland, Ohio, in a modest 2-bedroom house with siding that's seen better decades. My truck is paid off, but it rattles when I idle at red lights. I'm not poor, but I'm not comfortable either. I fix things for other people for a living, and somehow I've learned to live with a few things as staying broken in my own life. My father, Frank Harlow, was the opposite. He couldn't leave anything broken. Frank was 74 when he passed. A quiet man, solid. He'd spent most of his life as a floor accountant and later a site supervisor at a manufacturing plant that doesn't exist anymore. When the company folded, he didn't complain. He just tightened his belt and kept going. Dad lived simply. Same coat every winter, same black coffee every morning. He had a saying he repeated anytime I rushed a job or tried to eyeball a measurement. Measure twice, he'd say, tapping the side of the tape with his knuckle. Cut once. I didn't realize until much later that he didn't just mean wood. The funeral was on a Thursday, gray sky, cold wind that cut through your jacket no matter how thick it was. My wife, Nicole, organized most of it. She's good at that, list timelines, making sure everything runs efficiently. She believes emotions are something you manage, not something you indulge. The service was short, polite. Everyone said the right things. I stood at the front next to Nicole, nodding when I was supposed to nod, shaking hands when they were extended to me. I remember thinking how strange it was that my father, who had built so many things with his hands, had been reduced to a few sentences read off a card. Afterward, we went back to the house, Dad's house, the one I grew up in. Nicole walked through the rooms with a critical eye, already talking about what should be donated, what might be worth selling. My brother-in-law, Derek, her older brother, showed up late and stayed long enough to mention estate logistics and market timing before disappearing again. Derek always talked like life was one long investment pitch. I drifted away from them and ended up in the garage. That was where Dad really lived. Pegboards lined with tools older than me. Coffee cans full of screws sorted by size. A red metal toolbox sat under the workbench, dented on one corner. I remembered something Dad had said to me a few months earlier, when I'd stopped by to fix his water heater. If anything ever happens to me, he'd said, not looking up from the wrench in his hand, check the red box. At the time, I thought he meant the documents. Deed, insurance, that sort of thing. I opened it. Inside were the usual tools, wrenches, sockets, a worn tape measure. But tucked beneath a folded shop rag was something that didn't belong. A small leather-bound passbook, edges cracked with age. The kind you don't see anymore. I brought it inside, curious more than anything. I hadn't even fully processed what it was when Nicole saw it. She glanced at the cover barely a second and laughed. Not amused. Dismissive. "That's useless," she said. "Those old accounts don't even exist anymore. Just throw it away." She took it from my hand and dropped it into the kitchen trash, right on top of a paper plate and some napkins from the funeral catering. Something about the way she did it, quick, final, stuck with me. If it meant nothing, why rush? That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet. I kept hearing Dad's voice in my head. Measure twice. Cut once. At 5 in the morning, I got out of bed, walked into the kitchen, and pulled the passbook out of the trash. Tucked into the back cover was a folded slip of paper, an account number, and 6 words written in my father's careful block handwriting. "Don't ask your wife. Go to the bank." By 9 o'clock that morning, I was driving. The drive to the bank took just under 2 hours, but it felt longer because I kept replaying that morning in my head. Nicole hadn't noticed the passbook was gone, or if she had, she hadn't said anything yet. The house had been quiet when I left, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're sneaking away, even when you're doing nothing wrong. I turned the radio off after 10 minutes. I needed to think. My father wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't leave riddles. He didn't speak in half-truths or jokes that meant something else later. If he wrote, "Don't ask your wife," it wasn't paranoia. It was instruction. And if he told me to go to the bank, it meant there was something there worth seeing with my own eyes. Halfway there, my phone rang. Nicole. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Where are you?" she asked. Not accusatory, curious, too calm. "Running an errand," I said. "I took the morning off." A pause. I could hear her thinking. "You didn't take anything else from the house, did you?" "Your dad's, I mean." "Just some old manuals," I said. "Stuff from the garage." Another pause, shorter this time. "Okay," she said. "Just checking. Derek mentioned we should keep everything together until we figure out the estate." I agreed, hung up, and immediately felt that tight, familiar pressure in my chest, the one that shows up when something isn't being said out loud. 9 hours later, almost to the minute, my phone rang again. This time it was Derek. "Ethan," he said, sounding friendly in that way people do when they're trying to sound like they've always been friendly. "Just wanted to check in. This whole thing with your dad, it's a lot." "Yeah," I said. "I told Nicole I'd help handle the paperwork," he continued. "You don't need to stress about it. Banks, accounts, property, this stuff gets messy fast." I glanced at the passbook sitting in the cup holder beside me. "I'm okay," I said. "Just tying up a loose end." Derek chuckled softly. "Your dad didn't really have loose ends, Ethan. You know that. Simple life. Best thing is to let it go." When we hung up, my hands were gripping the steering wheel harder than they needed to. 2 calls, perfectly spaced, both telling me in different words not to ask questions. That was the second measurement. I kept driving. The bank was in a small town called Millbrook, the kind of place where the diner closes at 2 and everyone knows which car belongs to which house. The building itself was old but clean, brick facade, glass doors that squeaked faintly when I pushed them open. Inside, everything smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. I waited in line behind a woman depositing checks for a bake sale. When it was my turn, I slid the passbook across the counter, along with my ID and my father's death certificate. The young teller smiled politely and typed the account number into her computer. Her smile faded. "Just one moment," she said, and disappeared into the back. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I started to feel foolish. Maybe Nicole was right. Maybe this really was nothing. An old account closed years ago, a wild goose chase fueled by grief and too little sleep. Then a woman in a dark blue blazer approached. Mid-50s, gray streaks in her hair, calm eyes. "I'm Gwen Alvarez," she said. "The branch manager. Would you come with me, please?" Her office was small and quiet, with framed certificates on the wall and a plant that looked like it had survived a lot. She closed the door gently behind us and sat across from me, the passbook laid flat between her hands. "This account," she said carefully, "is flagged." I blinked. "Flagged how?" "Not because of anything you've done," she said quickly, "but because of its history." She turned her monitor slightly so I could see. Lines of numbers, dates. Then she reached for a notepad, wrote something down, and slid it across the desk. The number made my stomach drop. "Is that the balance?" I asked. She nodded once. I stared at the paper. My father, who reused envelopes and fixed his own shoes, had left behind just under $2 million. "I don't understand," I said. "There's more," Gwen said. In 2016, someone had attempted to access the account using power of attorney documents. The paperwork looked legitimate at first glance, but the bank's verification system flagged inconsistencies in the signatures. The transfer was denied. The attempt was logged. And the person listed, I asked, already knowing the answer. Gwen met my eyes. "Nicole Harlow." The room felt suddenly smaller. Gwen stood. "I'm going to ask you to wait here," she said. "I need to make a call." She stepped outside and spoke in low tones I couldn't hear. I sat there staring at my hands, at the faint scars on my knuckles from years of work, at the passbook my father had hidden like a last defense. When Gwen returned, she didn't sit down right away. "Mr. Harlow," she said softly, "you need to sit down." That was when I realized my legs were shaking. I don't remember sitting back down, but I must have, because the next thing I noticed was the chair pressing into the backs of my legs and the faint hum of the air conditioner above us. Gwen Alvarez stood near the door phone, still in her hand, as if she were making sure it stayed closed. "I'm going to be very clear," she said, returning to her seat. "This doesn't mean your wife has been charged with anything. Not yet. But it does mean this account is now considered potential evidence." "Evidence of what?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened a drawer and took out a thin folder. Inside were printouts, timestamps, scanned documents, notes written in neat professional shorthand. "Elder financial exploitation," she said finally. "It's one of the fastest growing categories of fraud we see, and most of the time, it involves family." The word family landed harder than the number had. Gwen explained that after the failed attempt in 2016, the account had been locked down internally. No further access attempts were made. Whoever tried once never tried again, but the record stayed, quiet, waiting. "Your father set this up very deliberately," she said, tapping the passbook. "The cover suggests it's decades old, but the account itself was opened in 2011. That mismatch alone tells us he wanted it hidden. Hidden from who, I asked, though I already knew. Gwen slid another document toward me. "Before we continue, there's someone who needs to speak with you." There was a knock at the door. A woman stepped in, mid-40s, hair pulled back, expression sharp but not unkind. She wore plain clothes, but her posture told me everything. "I'm Detective Mariah Benton," she said, extending her hand. "Financial Crimes Division." I shook it automatically. "We're not here to accuse," Benton said, sitting across from me. "We're here to understand. Your father's name came up in a review after this account was flagged again yesterday." "Again?" I asked. She nodded. "Because you walked in with the passbook." Benton asked questions the way professionals do, calm, specific, patient. "Who handled my father's finances in the last 10 years? Who had access to his mail, his passwords, his checkbook?" As she spoke memories I hadn't paid much attention to started lining up in my head. Nicole insisting she'd take care of the bills when Dad's eyesight got worse. Nicole answering his phone when I called. Nicole telling me Dad was confused that he'd mixed up dates, forgotten conversations. I had believed her. Why wouldn't I? "Did your father ever mention feeling pressured?" Benton asked. I hesitated. Then I remembered the way he'd looked at me months ago in the garage. Not weak, not confused, just careful. "He told me to check the red toolbox," I said quietly, "and not to ask my wife." Benton didn't react. She just nodded like she'd heard this story before. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "We're going to open an investigation. That means you can't confront anyone. Not your wife, not her brother. If they know what we're looking at, they'll destroy evidence." My throat felt dry. "You're asking me to pretend everything is normal?" "Yes," she said, "for now." When I left the bank, the world felt wrong. Brighter, louder, like someone had turned the contrast up too high. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes before turning the key. That evening, Nicole acted like nothing had happened. She asked what I wanted for dinner, complained about traffic, mentioned Derek had a great idea about selling some of Dad's old equipment. I watched her hands while she talked, steady, confident, the hands of someone who believed the story she was telling. Over the next few days, the calls continued, Derek checking in, Nicole asking small, pointed questions. Where had I gone? Why was I late? Had the bank been busy? I answered carefully, short sentences, no details. At night, I started writing things down, dates, times, exact words. I didn't tell myself why, I just did it. Maybe because my father would have. Measure twice. A week later, Detective Benton called. "We traced some transfers," she said. "They don't come directly from your father's accounts. They move through a shell company first." My stomach tightened. "Whose?" "Your brother-in-law's," she said, "Derek Vaughn." I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall. "There's more," Benton added. "We're going to need you to meet with a lawyer your father trusted. His name is Harold Klein. He's been holding something for you." "What kind of something?" I asked. Benton paused. "The kind that explains why your father waited so long." When I hung up, Nicole walked into the room. "You okay?" she asked, studying my face. "You've been quiet lately." I forced a smile, "Just tired." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on me a second too long. That night, lying in bed beside her, I realized something that scared me more than the money, more than the investigation. My father hadn't just hidden an account. He'd been preparing for this. Harold Klein's office was exactly what I expected a 76-year-old attorney's office to look like. Dark wood shelves bowed under the weight of thick binders. Framed diplomas yellowed with age hung slightly crooked on the wall. The air smelled faintly of paper leather and old coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Harold himself rose slowly when I entered, tall, but stooped, his movements careful in the way of someone who had learned patience the hard way. "Ethan Harlow," he said, extending his hand. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you," I replied. His grip was firm, grounding. We sat across from each other at a heavy desk that had likely outlived more than one marriage and career. For a moment he just looked at me as if measuring something invisible. "Frank told me this day might come," Harold said finally. "He just didn't know when." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. It landed on the desk with a soft but undeniable weight. "Your father asked me to give you this only after you brought the passbook to the bank," he said. "Not before. Not if you found it and decided to let it go. Only if you followed through." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of documents, bank statements, handwritten notes, and side-by-side comparisons of signatures. On the left, my father's real signature. Uneven pressure, slight tremor. On the right, the forged version. Too clean, too consistent. He noticed, Harold said quietly, "Right away." The notes were meticulous. Dates, amounts, account numbers. Each questionable transaction was circled in red ink, followed by a short observation, written in my father's precise block letters. Transfer unauthorized. Signature mismatch. Confronted, denied. "He came to me in 2017, Harold continued. Told me he believed his daughter-in-law was siphoning money. He had proof but no authority. She had power of attorney by then." I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "Why didn't he go to the police?" Harold sighed. "He tried, informally, but he'd already been labeled as confused. Once that narrative sticks, it's hard to shake, especially when the person controlling your care is the one telling the story." At the bottom of the folder was a notarized affidavit dated 2 years earlier. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. "I am of sound mind. I know exactly what I am doing. I am being financially exploited by a family member. I am documenting this so the truth will outlive the lies." My vision blurred for a moment. He knew he couldn't win while he was alive, Harold said, so he prepared for after. I flipped to the last section of the folder, a single page separate from the rest. "Frank called it his insurance," Harold explained. "The account you found. He moved what he could before the pressure became unbearable, hid it behind something old and unremarkable, and he trusted you to finish the job." "Why me?" I asked. Harold smiled sadly. "Because you ask questions. Because you fix things instead of ignoring them. Because you didn't rush. Measure twice, cut once." When I left Harold's office, my phone buzzed almost immediately. "Detective Benton." "We're close," she said. "We filed for warrants. Financial records, electronic devices, office space tied to Derek's company." My heart thudded. "Soon," she said. "But I need you to keep doing what you've been doing. Normal, quiet." That night, Nicole watched me more closely than usual. She asked if I was feeling okay, if work was stressful, if I wanted to talk. "I'm fine," I said, "just tired." Later, as she washed dishes, she glanced over her shoulder. "You didn't go back to the bank again, did you?" "No," I replied, meeting her eyes. "Why?" She shrugged. "Just seems like the kind of thing people do when they're worried." I smiled, slow and careful. "I'm not worried." But she didn't smile back. 2 days later, Detective Benton called again. "We're moving tomorrow," she said. "Simultaneous warrants, no warning. I thought you'd want to know." I hung up and sat alone in my truck for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My father had measured every step, documented every cut. He hadn't been weak or confused. He had been patient, and tomorrow his patience was about to pay off. The call came at 6:12 in the morning. Detective Benton didn't waste words. "It's happening today," she said. 7 a.m. sharp, simultaneous warrants. I was already awake. I'd been lying there staring at the ceiling, listening to Nicole's breathing beside me, counting it the way I used to count my father's steps in the garage when I was a kid. Slow, even, controlled. I wondered if she sensed anything, if some instinct was whispering that the ground beneath her was about to give way. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I won't ask you to be there," Benton replied. "In fact, it's better if you aren't. Just stay available." After we hung up, I slipped out of bed and dressed quietly. The house was dim, early morning blue light leaking through the blinds. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the mug, feeling its heat without registering the comfort. At exactly 7, my phone buzzed again. "We're at your residence," Benton said. "Stand by." I stared at the front door, half expecting it to explode inward. Instead, the house stayed still. Nicole was upstairs, probably getting dressed for work, thinking it was just another Tuesday. I wondered what it was like that last moment before the truth arrives, when everything still feels normal. I wasn't there when they knocked. Benton told me later. 2 officers, badges visible, calm voices, no shouting. Nicole answered in her robe, coffee cup in hand. She tried the smile first, then confusion, then offense. The practiced layers of a woman who had talked her way out of things her entire life. When the warrant was read, fraud, forgery, elder financial exploitation, the smile vanished. For just a second, her face went blank, like a mask slipping. Across town at the same moment, officers walked into Derek's office. He was in a meeting with 2 clients, mid-sentence, hand raised to emphasize a point about long-term growth. The room went quiet when the badges came out. Derek tried to laugh it off, asked if there had been some mistake, mentioned his attorney. The officers weren't interested. By 8:30, both of them were in custody. I found out sitting in my truck outside a hardware store, watching a man load bags of mulch into his trunk like it was any other morning in America. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt tired. That afternoon, Nicole's lawyer called. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Mr. Harlow, my client believes there's been a misunderstanding. These situations can escalate unnecessarily if emotions get involved." I said nothing. "She's prepared to return a portion of the funds," he continued. "We could settle this quietly, avoid the stress of a prolonged investigation." "A portion," I repeated. "Yes," he said quickly. "Given the circumstances, your father's condition, the informal nature of the arrangements." "My father wasn't confused," I said, "and there was nothing informal about forged signatures." Silence on the line. The lawyer cleared his throat. "You should consider what this will do to your family." I thought of my father sitting alone at his kitchen table documenting thefts no one believed. "I already have," I said, and hung up. That night I went back to my father's house. The place felt different now, lighter somehow. I walked through the room, slowly touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the workbench, the red toolbox still sitting where it always had. On the workbench was a yellow legal pad. My father's handwriting filled the top page. "If you're reading this, things have started moving." I sat down hard on the stool. The rest of the page was instructions. Not about money, about patience, about letting systems work, about not seeking revenge, just truth. "Justice isn't loud," he'd written, "it's thorough." 2 days later, Detective Benton called again. "They're talking," she said, "separately, blaming each other. That usually means we're on the right track." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "we build the case." As the investigation widened, details surfaced that made my stomach turn. Transfers routed through Derek's shell company disguised as consulting fees. Emails between him and Nicole discussing timing and what Frank remembers. A pattern that stretched back nearly a decade. This hadn't been desperation. It had been a plan. When I finally saw Nicole again, it was through a glass partition at the detention center. She looked smaller, tired, angry. "You did this," she said flatly into the phone. "No," I replied, "you did." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the man on the other side. Maybe she didn't. Maybe the version of me that stayed quiet and trusted her was gone. As I left, I realized something else. This wasn't the end. It was just the moment the lie stopped running. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, though the air conditioning hummed with institutional indifference, but emotionally. Everything about it felt designed to drain color from people. Gray walls, pale wood, straight-back benches that reminded you this wasn't a place for comfort. I sat in the second row, hands folded, watching my life get translated into exhibits and evidence. Nicole entered, first flanked by her attorney. She wore a navy blazer. I recognized the one she saved for meetings where she needed to look reasonable. Composed. Wronged. When she saw me, her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Derek came in separately. No blazer, no confidence. His eyes darted around the room like he was still searching for an angle that didn't exist anymore. The prosecutor laid it out methodically, not dramatically. That was the most unsettling part. There were no raised voices, no moral speeches, just timelines, documents, numbers. In 2012, Frank Harlow granted limited power of attorney for medical coordination only. In 2014, additional documents appeared broadening financial control. In 2016, the forged signatures. In 2017 through 2021, incremental transfers routed through shell accounts. Each point landed like a measured tap of a hammer. The bank's forensic analyst testified next. She explained how signature pressure works, how muscle memory leaves traces no forger can fully replicate. On the screen behind her, my father's real signature appeared beside the fake one. "You see this hesitation," she said, pointing. "This is human. This is age. This is real." Then she gestured to the other. "This is smooth. Uniform. Practiced." Nicole's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Detective Benton testified after that. Calm, direct. She explained elder financial exploitation in plain language, how caregivers isolate, how they rewrite narratives, how victims begin to doubt themselves. "These cases don't start with theft," she said. "They start with control." When Derek's shell company came up, Vaughn Consulting LLC, the room shifted. Emails were read aloud. Phrases like, "move it before he notices," and "he's not tracking dates anymore," echoed against the walls. Derek stared at the table. Nicole stared straight ahead. Then Harold Klein took the stand. He held my father's affidavit like it was something fragile. "Frank Harlow was of sound mind," Harold said firmly. "He was frightened. He was isolated, but he was not confused." The judge listened carefully, took notes, asked questions that cut through the noise. When it was over, when both sides had rested, the room felt hollow, like everyone had already reached the same conclusion and was just waiting for it to be spoken out loud. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Nicole stood when her name was called. Her attorney argued for leniency, stress, miscommunication, good intentions gone wrong. The judge's response was quiet and devastating. "This was not an accident," he said. "This was sustained deception. 7 years in federal prison, restitution ordered, assets seized." Derek's sentence followed. 3 years, no deal, no reduction. The shell company made that impossible. When the gavel came down, I felt nothing, no surge of victory, no relief, just a strange sense of finality, like a door closing softly behind me. Outside the courthouse, Detective Benton found me near the steps. "Your father would be proud," she said. "I wish he didn't have to be," I replied. A week later, Harold called. "There's one more thing," he said. "Frank asked me to give it to you after everything was resolved." I met him at his office again. Same desk, same smell of old paper. He slid a sealed envelope across to me. My name was written on it in my father's careful handwriting. I didn't open it right away. Harold waited, respectful, silent. When I finally did, the paper inside was thin folded once. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then the truth did what it always does. It waited. I'm sorry I couldn't stop this while I was alive, but I knew you would finish it. Don't let this harden you. Use what's left to build something honest. Measure twice. Cut once." I folded the letter and held it against my chest longer than I meant to. That night, I sat alone in my truck parked outside my house and realized something important. Justice had been served, but healing was still my responsibility. 6 months after the sentencing, my life looked quiet from the outside. No court dates, no phone calls from detectives, no lawyers' voices leaving careful messages on my voicemail, the kind of silence people usually crave. But silence isn't empty when you've earned it the hard way. The money took time to settle. Accounts had to be untangled, assets liquidated, restitution calculated and transferred. I let Harold Klein handle most of it. I trusted him. My father had trusted him. That was enough. When the final numbers came through, I didn't feel rich. I felt steady. For the first time in years, there was no weight pressing against my chest when I opened my mailbox or checked my balance. I paid off my truck, cleared the mortgage, set aside what I needed to live without fear. And then I did something my father would have understood. I built something useful. Not flashy, not impressive to people like Derek, just honest. I bought a small corner property downtown, a narrow storefront with big windows and a cracked concrete floor. It used to be a print shop. Now it's a repair space. Part workshop, part classroom. I fix appliances people can't afford to replace. I teach basic maintenance on weekends, how to change filters, how to listen to a machine before it breaks, On the back wall above the main workbench, I hung my father's tape measure. The old one. The metal edge worn smooth from decades of use. Next to it framed simply his words. Measure twice, cut once. People ask about it sometimes. I just tell them it belonged to someone who believed in doing things carefully. Nicole writes letters from prison, long ones. Pages filled with explanations, accusations, apologies that circle back into blame. She says I ruined everything, that I betrayed her, that families shouldn't do this to each other. I don't respond. Some doors once closed don't need to be reopened to prove they're locked. Derek's wife divorced him. His company dissolved. The clients disappeared as quickly as they'd once praised him. When someone builds their life on shortcuts, it turns out there's nothing underneath when the shortcuts collapse. Once Harold asked if I wanted to visit Nicole, or Derek. Closure, he called it. I thought about it for a day. Then I said no. Closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you choose when you stop waiting for explanations that won't heal you. Sometimes late in the afternoon when the shop is quiet and the light slants just right through the windows, I hear my father's voice in my head. Not the serious one, the softer one, the one he used when he was teaching, not correcting. I wish he were here to see this place. I wish he'd never needed to hide anything. I wish he'd been believed when it mattered. But I also know this: he wasn't defeated. He was patient. He left behind more than money. He left a record, a truth that outlived the lies, and he trusted me to carry it the rest of the way. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever been told you were imagining things, that you were overreacting, that it was better not to ask questions, I hope you hear this part clearly. Pay attention to what doesn't make sense. Write things down. Trust patterns, not promises. The truth doesn't rush, it waits. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I know it wasn't easy, but some journeys matter precisely because they're uncomfortable. If you want to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear them. Tell me what stood out to you or where you're listening from. We have many more stories like this to tell, stories about patience, resilience, and the quiet moments when everything finally becomes clear. If you don't want to miss them, please consider subscribing. Let's keep walking this road together.